The pounding started at 6:03 in the morning, sounding less like a neighbor and more like authority. I opened the door to find a deputy holding a clipboard and an eviction order. Across the street, my parents stood by the stop sign, watching like they had paid for front row seats as the officer read the plaintiffs' names. My stomach dropped because I realized this was not a mistake, but a cold-blooded plan to steal my home. My name is Scarlett Diaz, and if there is one thing I have learned from 30 years of navigating the turbulent waters of my family dynamic, it is that catastrophe rarely announces itself with a scream. It usually arrives with a knock. The sound that pulled me from a dead sleep was not the tentative tap of a neighbor looking to borrow sugar, nor was it the frantic pounding of someone reporting a fire. It was a heavy rhythmic thud, metal against wood, authoritative and demanding. It was the sound of a gavel striking a podium, transposed onto my front door. I rolled over and slapped my hand against the nightstand, my fingers fumbling for my phone. The screen lit up the darkness of my bedroom, blinding me for a split second. 6:03 in the morning. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a primal rhythm of flight that tried to overtake my brain. But I forced a breath into my lungs and held it there. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. Panic was the currency my parents traded in, and I had stopped buying into their economy years ago. I threw the duvet off my legs, the cold air of the house biting at my bare skin. I grabbed my robe from the hook on the back of the door, cinching the belt tight around my waist as if it were armor. I walked out into the hallway, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors I had refinished myself 2 years ago. Every step was a calculation. I ran a hand through my hair, smoothing it down. I could not open the door looking like a victim. I could not look disheveled, manic, or confused. In my family, looking confused was practically an admission of guilt. It gave them the opening they needed to label me unstable, emotional, or incapable. I reached the front door and stopped. I did not unlock it immediately. Instead, I leaned forward and pressed my eye to the peephole, the brass cold against my skin. The fisheye lens distorted the world outside, but the image was clear enough to send a fresh wave of adrenaline through my veins. A deputy stood on my porch. He was tall, his uniform pressed, a badge gleaming dully under the porch light. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, a posture of practiced neutrality. In his left hand, he held a clipboard. His right hand rested near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to signal readiness. Beyond him, parked at the curb, was a patrol cruiser. The lights were off. The engine was silent. It sat there like a shark in shallow water, dark and sleek. He had not used the siren. He had not flashed the lights. He had arrived in stealth, as if he did not want to wake the neighborhood, or perhaps as if he wanted to catch me off guard before I had the chance to fortify my defenses. Then, my gaze shifted. Movement in the background caught my eye. Across the street, standing directly under the street lamp that illuminated the corner of Briar Glen and Elm, were 2 figures. They were not passing through. They were not walking a dog. They were standing still, their bodies angled toward my house, their arms crossed over their chests. My breath hitched in my throat. It was Gwen and Hector Diaz, my parents. They looked like they were waiting for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. My father, Hector, was wearing his beige windbreaker, the one he wore when he wanted to look like a harmless retiree. My mother, Gwen, stood beside him, her posture erect, her chin lifted slightly. They were watching my front door with a terrifying, serene patience. They looked like they had purchased front-row tickets to my execution and were just waiting for the curtain to rise. I pulled back from the peephole, my mind racing. Why were they here? Why was the police here? The 2 facts collided in my brain, sparking a terrifying realization. This was not a wellness check. This was an orchestrated strike. I took one more stabilizing breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door. The morning air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. The deputy turned his head as the door creaked open. He looked me up and down, his eyes scanning for threats, for weapons, for signs of non-compliance. He saw a woman in a bathrobe, barefoot, with a face set in stone. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, professional and detached. "Are you Scarlett Diaz?" "I am," I said. My voice surprised me. It was steady. It did not shake. It sounded like the voice I used in boardrooms at Crestline Compliance Solutions, not the voice of a daughter terrified of her parents. "I am Deputy Larkin with the Redwood County Sheriff's Office," he stated, shifting the clipboard in his hand. "I am here to serve a writ of possession regarding this property." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. Writ of possession. For a second, the language did not compute. I worked in risk management. I dealt with contracts, clauses, and liability every single day. I knew what those words meant legally, but emotionally, my brain refused to attach them to the structure standing behind me. This was not a property. This was the home my grandfather had left me. This was the place where I had scraped paint, sanded floors, and rebuilt my life after cutting ties with the toxicity across the street. "Eviction," I said. The word tasted like ash. "Yes, ma'am," Deputy Larkin said. He pulled a thick packet of papers from the clip. "The court has issued an order for immediate possession of the premises. You are hereby ordered to vacate." "This is my house," I said. It was a reflex. It was the truth. I did not scream it. I did not wail. I stated it as a fact, the same way I would state that the sky is blue or that water is wet. "I own this property. My grandfather left it to me in his will. The deed is in my name." Deputy Larkin did not blink. He did not look sympathetic, nor did he look cruel. He looked like a machine that had been programmed to execute a specific task. "I am not here to argue the merits of the case. Ms. Diaz, I am not a judge. I am solely here to enforce the order signed by the court. As of this moment, you are trespassing on this property." Trespassing. In the house where my coffee cup was sitting in the sink, in the house where my clothes were hanging in the closet. "That is impossible," I said. My mind racing through the filing cabinets of my memory. I paid my property taxes. I paid my insurance. There was no mortgage. The house was owned free and clear. "I have never received a notice. I have never been served a summons. You cannot evict someone without due process." "The process has been completed, ma'am," Larkin said, extending the paperwork toward me. "A default judgment was entered last week. The writ was issued yesterday." He looked at his watch. It was a bulky, tactical thing on his wrist. "You have until 1200 hours today to remove your personal effects and vacate the premises," he said. "At noon, the locks will be changed. If you are still on the property at that time, you will be physically removed and arrested for trespassing." Noon, less than 6 hours. My vision blurred at the edges, a physiological response to the spike in blood pressure. But I forced my eyes to stay focused on his face. I could feel the presence of my parents across the street, burning into my peripheral vision. They were watching this interaction. They were watching the deputy hand me the papers. They were feeding on it. I needed to know. I needed to hear him say it. "Who is the plaintiff?" I asked. "Who filed this order?" Deputy Larkin paused. For the first time, his professional mask slipped, just a fraction of an inch. He looked down at the paperwork in his hand, his eyes scanning the top line of the caption. He hesitated. It was a small hesitation, a micro-expression of discomfort. He looked at the paper, then he looked at me, and then his eyes darted briefly over my shoulder, toward the street, as if he suddenly sensed the audience watching us. He seemed to realize, in that split second, that he had walked into something far darker than a standard landlord-tenant dispute. He realized he was the weapon in a domestic war. "The plaintiffs are listed as Gwen Diaz and Hector Diaz," he said. Hearing their names spoken aloud by a law enforcement officer felt like a physical blow to the chest. It was one thing to suspect it. It was another to have it confirmed by the badge standing on my porch. My parents. The people who were supposed to protect me. The people who had told me, years ago, that they were so proud I had a place of my own, even as they criticized every choice I made regarding it. I slowly turned my head. I could not help it. I looked across the street. The morning sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, casting a long, pale light down Briar Glen. Gwen and Hector were still there. They had not moved. They had not flinched. When my eyes met theirs, my mother smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not the smile of a mother greeting her child. It was a tight, satisfied expression, a closing of a ledger. It was a smile that said, "I told you so." It was a smile that said, "You thought you could get away from us. You thought you could have something that was yours alone. But we found a way to take it back." It was a seal of betrayal, stamped in red lipstick. I turned back to Deputy Larkin. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so cold and concentrated it felt like liquid nitrogen pumping through my veins. I took the paperwork from his hand. The paper felt heavy, thick with legal authority. "I am going to need to see the proof of service," I said. My voice was quieter now. Dangerous. Because I was never served. "That is a matter for the court," Larkin said. Though his tone was less robotic now. He had seen the look on my face. He had seen the people across the street. He knew something was wrong. "But right now, the order stands. 12 noon. Ms. Diaz, I suggest you start packing." "I am not packing," I said. Larkin stiffened. "Ma'am, do not make this difficult. If you resist—" "I am not resisting," I cut him off. "And I am not packing. I am going to read this order, and then I am going to fix it." I looked down at the paperwork in my hand. The font was Standard Times New Roman. 12 point. Superior Court of California, County of Redwood. Case number CV-24-00918. Gwen Diaz and Hector Diaz versus Scarlett Diaz. It looked official. It had a judge's stamp. It had a file date. It was a lie wrapped in the trappings of the truth. They had weaponized the legal system against me. They had filed paperwork behind my back, likely sent the service to a fake address, waited for the clock to run out, and obtained a default judgment because I never showed up to a fight I did not know was happening. It was brilliant. It was evil. And it was exactly the kind of thing Gwen and Hector would do. 12 noon, Larkin repeated, stepping back off the porch step. "I will be back." He turned and walked back to his cruiser. He did not look at my parents across the street, though I knew he wanted to. He got into his car, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet morning. He started the engine and drove away slowly, disappearing around the corner. I stood alone on my porch, clutching the eviction order. The cold morning air seeped through my robe, but I barely felt it. I looked across the street one last time. My father said something to my mother. She nodded, laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried on the wind, and then they turned around. They began walking back toward their car, which must have been parked a block away. They walked with a bounce in their step. They thought they had won. They thought that because a deputy showed up with a gun and a piece of paper, I would crumble. They thought I would call them crying, begging for help, begging for a place to stay, falling right back into the web of control they had spun for 30 years. They had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten that I was the one who handled compliance audits for Fortune 500 companies. They had forgotten that my job was to find the cracks in the paperwork, to find the discrepancies in the logs, to find the truth buried under mountains of bureaucracy. They thought this was the end of the story. They thought they were writing the final chapter where the prodigal daughter returns home, broken and defeated. I looked down at the paperwork again, rid of possession. I stepped back inside my house and closed the door. I locked the deadbolt. I threw the chain latch. 6 hours, I whispered to the empty hallway. I walked into the kitchen and placed the stack of papers on the granite island, the island I had paid for with my first bonus check. I turned on the coffee maker. I did not start packing boxes. I did not call a moving van. I did not call my parents. I went to my home office and opened the fireproof safe where I kept my own records. My grandfather's will, the original deed, the transfer documents, the property tax receipts for the last 5 years. My parents had started a war at 6:03 in the morning. They wanted drama? No. Drama is messy. Drama is emotional. This was not going to be a drama. This was going to be an audit. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the court clerk's office, knowing it would not open for another 2 hours. But needing to have the number ready to dial the second the clock struck 8, I looked at the clock on the microwave. 6:15. I had 5 hours and 45 minutes to overturn a court order, prove fraud, and save my home. I sat down at the table. The eviction notice spread out before me like a battle map. My mother's smile was burned into my retinas. But as I uncapped my red pen and began to circle the irregularities on the first page of the writ, I felt the cold, hard calm of the professional take over. They wanted the house. They wanted me on the street. They were going to get neither. I took a sip of the stale water sitting in a glass on the table and began to read. The first thing I noticed was the address listed for service. It was not my address. It was a place I had not lived in 10 years. I circled it. The ink bled slightly into the paper. "Game on," I said. The house on Briar Glen was never just a structure to me. It was not merely wood, stucco, and shingles held together by nails and gravity. To the county assessor, it was a 1,200-square-foot craftsman bungalow, built in 1948, sitting on a quarter-acre lot in a neighborhood that was slowly gentrifying from working-class quiet to young professional trendy. To me, it was the only place on this earth where I had ever been allowed to simply exist without paying a toll. I looked around the kitchen, my eyes tracing the lines of the cabinets I had sanded and repainted myself 2 summers ago. I remembered the heat of that July, the smell of sawdust and primer, the feeling of sweat running down my back. I had spent $8,000 of my own savings on the renovation materials alone. Not to mention the hundreds of hours of labor. Every time I drove a nail or laid a tile, I was sewing myself into the fabric of this place. I was claiming it. But my claim did not start with sweat equity. It started with a piece of paper signed by a dying man who knew exactly who his daughter and son-in-law were. My grandfather, Arthur, had been the only person in my family who looked at me and saw a person rather than an investment. When he passed away 3 years ago, the reading of the will had been a spectacle of suppressed rage. Gwen and Hector had walked into that attorney's office wearing black, dabbing dry eyes with tissues, fully expecting the estate to flow vertically to them, as tradition dictated. They had already spent the money in their heads. I could tell by the way my father had been eyeing a new boat catalog the week before the funeral, when the attorney read the clause regarding the property at 78 Briar Glen. The air in the room had vanished, to my granddaughter, Scarlett Diaz. I leave my home and all its contents, for she is the only one who ever made it feel like a home. I remembered the silence that followed. It was heavy, thick, and sharp. My mother did not scream. Gwen Diaz does not scream in public. She simply stiffened, her spine turning into a steel rod, and turned to look at me with an expression that was halfway between shock and calculation. That was the moment the war really began. Though I was too naive to realize they would escalate it to this level. They viewed the inheritance not as a gift to me, but as a theft from them. In their worldview, I was an extension of them, and therefore, anything I owned was actually theirs by proxy. This entitlement was not new. It was the foundational dynamic of my entire life. Growing up with Gwen and Hector was an exercise in transactional affection. Love was not a baseline. It was a reward for performance. If I brought home an A on my report card, I was their brilliant daughter. If I won a debate trophy, I was the pride of the family. But if I stumbled, if I gained 5 pounds, if I expressed an opinion that contradicted theirs, the warmth evaporated instantly. I would be met with cold shoulders, heavy sighs, and the silent treatment that could last for days. I learned very early on that their approval was a rented commodity, and the rent was due daily. I had spent my 20s trying to buy that approval. I paid off their credit card debt when my father made bad stock picks in 2010. I co-signed a loan for a car they did not need because they said they were going through a rough patch and just needed a little help to get back on their feet. I became their safety net. I taught them that if they pushed hard enough, if they guilt-tripped me effectively enough, I would fold. I would write the check. I would sign the paper. I would apologize for things I had not done just to restore the peace. That was the fatal flaw in my history. I had trained them to believe I was weak. They mistook my kindness for compliance. They mistook my desire for a family for a lack of a spine, but they did not understand who I had become in the last 5 years. They did not understand the woman who walked into the glass-walled offices of Crestline Compliance Solutions every morning at 8 o'clock. At Crestline, I worked in risk management and regulatory compliance. My entire professional existence revolved around the concept that people lie. But documentation does not. I spent my days auditing operational trails, verifying strict adherence to federal protocols, and hunting for the single discrepancy in a stack of 5,000 pages that proved someone was cutting corners. I knew how to track a digital footprint. I knew that every action in the modern world leaves a residue, a timestamp, a signature, a server log. I had learned that the systems of the world do not care about tears. A bank does not care if you are a good person. A court does not care if you are a loving mother. They care about what is on the page. They care about signatures, dates, and notarizations. If it is not written down, it did not happen. If it is written down and signed, it is the truth, even if it is a lie in reality. My parents did not know this version of me. They still saw the little girl who cried when they were disappointed. They did not see the auditor who could stare down a CEO and tell him his safety protocols were legally insufficient. I took a sip of my coffee, the caffeine hitting my bloodstream like a clarion call. I needed to think about the timeline. This ambush had not happened in a vacuum. For the past 6 months, the pressure from across the street had been mounting, subtle at first, then aggressive. It started with casual comments during Sunday dinners, which I still attended out of a misplaced sense of obligation. My father would talk about how the real estate market was peaking. He would say things like, Scarlett, a house this old is a money pit. You should really think about liquidating while the equity is high. I would brush it off. I love the house, Dad. I'm not selling. Then the tone shifted. My mother began sending me articles about family asset restructuring. She pitched the idea that we should put all our assets, my house included, into a single-family trust controlled by them. For tax purposes, and to protect the legacy, it makes no sense for you to bear the burden of property taxes alone, she had said, pouring wine with a shaking hand. If you sign the deed over to the trust, we can handle the administrative headache, and you can just live there rent-free. It is safer for everyone. I had refused, firmly. The house is in my name. It stays in my name. That was 2 months ago. The last time I said no, my father had slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. He had looked at me with a desperation I had never seen before. It was not just anger. It was fear. His eyes were wide, rimmed with red, and there was a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. "You are being selfish," he had shouted. "We need this structure. You do not understand the big picture." I did not understand the big picture then. But looking at the eviction notice on my kitchen island, the pixels of the image were starting to resolve. They were not just greedy. They were in trouble. I had seen the signs, though I had chosen to ignore them because facing them meant admitting my parents were drowning. The new car they had leased was gone, replaced by a 10-year-old sedan. My mother had stopped going to her weekly salon appointments. They had stopped talking about their retirement trips. And there were the phone calls, hushed conversations that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. Someone was squeezing them. Maybe it was gambling debts. My father had always fancied himself a poker player. Maybe it was a bad investment scheme. My mother was prone to believing in miracle returns, pitched by friends of friends. Or maybe they had simply lived beyond their means for so long that the credit house of cards had finally collapsed. Whatever the cause, they needed money, and they needed it fast. And the only asset they had access to, or thought they should have access to, was my house. The house on Briar Glen was worth at least $800,000 in the current market. That kind of money could solve a lot of problems, It could wipe out debt. It could buy silence. But to sell the house, they needed the title. And since I would not sign it over, they had decided to take it. I looked at the writ of possession again. The cold brutality of the tactic was starting to impress me in a sick way. This was not just about kicking me out. This was about time. If they had filed a normal lawsuit claiming ownership, it would have dragged on for months. I would have been notified. I would have hired a lawyer. We would have gone to discovery. They would have lost because the will was ironclad. But an eviction based on a fabricated landlord-tenant relationship? That moves at the speed of light. In California, unlawful detainer cases are summary proceedings. They are designed to move fast to protect landlords from deadbeat tenants. By framing me as a tenant who had stopped paying rent, and by ensuring I never received the initial court papers, they had bypassed the entire debate about ownership. They had tricked the court into treating this as a simple rental dispute, and the eviction itself, the deputy at 6 a.m, the lockout by noon, was the final piece of the strategy. It was designed to create chaos. They knew that if I was thrown out on the street with nothing but a suitcase, I would be in crisis mode. I would be worried about where to sleep, where to put my furniture, how to feed myself. I would be emotionally shattered. A homeless, crying daughter is easily manipulated. A homeless daughter might sign a settlement agreement just to get back into the house. A homeless daughter might not have access to her files, her records, her proof. By the time I managed to find a lawyer and explain that I actually owned the house, they could have already sold it to a third-party cash buyer. Once the house was sold to a bona fide purchaser who did not know about the fraud, getting it back would be a legal nightmare that could take 10 years. They were banking on the shock. They were banking on me collapsing. They were counting on the Scarlett of 10 years ago, the one who just wanted mommy and daddy to stop yelling. I stood up and walked to the window. I pulled back the curtain just an inch. The street was empty now. The deputy was gone. My parents were gone. The sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the lawn. They wanted to steal the time I needed to fight back. They wanted to disorient me so I would miss the window to file a motion. They wanted me to spend the next 4 hours packing boxes and crying, rather than drafting legal defenses. I let the curtain fall back into place. "You underestimated the auditor," I said to the empty room. I was not going to pack. I was not going to cry. I was going to use every single minute of the next 5 hours to dismantle their lie brick by brick. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I needed to prove that the foundation of their case, the idea that I was a tenant, was a fabrication, and I needed to do it before the sheriff returned with the locksmith. I turned back to my safe. I grabbed the binder labeled Property Records. I grabbed the binder labeled Estate Settlement. I grabbed my laptop. The shock had worn off completely now. In its place was a cold, high-speed clarity. It was the same feeling I got when I found a mismatch in a compliance log, a distinct frequency hum in my brain that signaled the hunt was on. They had brought a deputy to my door. They had tried to humiliate me in front of the neighborhood. They had tried to take the one thing my grandfather had given me to keep me safe. I opened my laptop and typed in the URL for the county court's case lookup system. My fingers flew across the keys. I was not just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting for my reality. I clicked search. The screen loaded, spinning for a second that felt like an hour. I was about to see exactly what lies they had told the judge to get this far, and then I was going to make them eat every single word. I flattened the pages of the eviction notice against the cool granite of my kitchen island, smoothing out the creases where my grip had tightened moments ago. My hands were steady now, operating with the mechanical precision of a surgeon preparing to cut. The panic that had threatened to suffocate me in the hallway had been compartmentalized. Shoved into a mental box labeled Deal with Later, right now. I did not need feelings. I needed data. I had the physical papers Deputy Larkin had handed me, but I knew the real story would be in the metadata, in the filing history that I had just pulled up on my laptop screen. The case file loaded, the progress bar crawling across the screen with agonizing slowness before snapping into focus. Case number CV 2400918. I cross-referenced the document in my hand with the digital file. My eyes scanned past the legalese, past the boilerplate language of unlawful detainer, hunting for the one thing that allows a court to strip a person of their home without them ever knowing about it. The proof of service. In the American legal system, you cannot be sued without being notified. It is the bedrock of due process. You have to be handed the papers, or at least, they have to be left with a responsible adult at your residence. If the court believes you were served and you do not show up, you lose by default. Game over. I clicked on the PDF labeled Proof of Service of Summons. The document opened. I zoomed in, the pixels sharpening into clarity. I read the sworn statement of the process server, a man named Gary Vance. He claimed that on January 15th, at 6:45 in the evening, he had personally served the summons to the defendant, Scarlett Diaz, or a suitable co-resident. Then I looked at the address. The air in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. 78 Juniper Trace, apartment 4B. I stared at the address, blinking, waiting for it to change. It did not. Juniper Trace. It was an apartment complex on the south side of town, a place with peeling paint and thin walls. It was the place my parents had rented 15 years ago, after they lost their first house to foreclosure, another financial disaster they had blamed on luck rather than their own mismanagement. I had lived there for 6 months after college while I saved for my first deposit. I had not lived there in nearly a decade. My parents had moved out of there 5 years ago. It was a ghost address, a dead letter drop, but the process server had sworn he went there, and he had sworn he found someone. I scrolled down to the section titled Manner of Service. The box for Substitute Service was checked. Documents left with Jane Doe. Description: adult female occupant, approximately 50 to 60 years of age, brown hair, refused to give name. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. Hot and acidic. Adult female occupant, 50 to 60 years of age. There was only one person who fit that description and had access to that old mail slot, or knew the neighbors well enough to intercept a process server at that specific location. My mother, Gwen Diaz, had not just filed a lawsuit, she had staged a play. She must have waited at that old apartment complex. Perhaps she even still had a key to the mailbox. Or she had simply loitered in the lobby knowing the process server was coming because she was the one who hired him. She had accepted the lawsuit meant for me, pretending to be my roommate or a relative living with me at an address I did not even inhabit. She had taken the papers, nodded at the server, and then likely thrown them into the nearest dumpster. She had looked a court officer in the eye and erased my existence. This was not just a trick. This was perjury. This was fraud on the court. I pushed the laptop away, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. They had calculated this perfectly. They knew that if the service looked legal on paper, the judge would have no choice but to grant the default judgment when I failed to appear. They had engineered my silence. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet, reaching up to the top shelf. I pulled down the heavy, fireproof accordion folder that contained my life. This was the life file. I had started it when I was 22. After my father accidentally lost my birth certificate when I needed it for a passport. I learned then that if I did not hold the paper, I did not own the truth. I carried the folder to the table and unlatched the buckle. I flipped past the tabs. Birth certificate, Social Security, car title. I stopped at the tab labeled Property, Briar Glen. I pulled out the grant deed. It was the original, with the embossed seal of the county recorder. Grantor, Arthur J. Miller. Grantee, Scarlett Diaz. My grandfather's signature was shaky but legible, inked in the blue ballpoint he always used. I pulled out the property tax bills for the last 3 years, all stamped paid in red ink. I pulled out the homeowner's insurance policy, listing me as the sole insured. I had a mountain of paper that proved I owned this house. My parents had a single fraudulent service form that said I was a tenant who didn't pay rent. Right now, the sheriff only cared about their piece of paper because it had a judge's signature on it. I looked at the clock. 7:58 in the morning. The court clerk's office opened at 8 o'clock sharp. I grabbed my phone. My thumb hovering over the keypad. I needed to be perfect. I could not be the hysterical daughter screaming about a conspiracy. I had to be the calm, rational victim of a clerical error. The court system is allergic to emotion. It responds to procedure. I dialed the number for the civil division. The line rang once, twice, a click, followed by the tinny sound of recorded jazz music. Thank you for calling the Redwood County Superior Court. All of our clerks are currently assisting other customers. I put the phone on speaker and set it on top of the pile of tax returns. I paced the kitchen. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Every second that ticked by was a second closer to Deputy Larkin returning with a bolt cutter. Civil Division, this is Linda, a voice said, sounding tired already. Good morning, Linda, I said. My voice was level, projecting the same professional warmth I used when telling a client they had failed an audit. My name is Scarlett Diaz. I am calling regarding case number CV 2400918. I heard the clicking of a keyboard on the other end. Okay, Diaz versus Diaz? Yes, I said. I have a deputy sheriff who just left my doorstep with a writ of possession. He stated I am to be evicted by 12 noon today. Okay, Linda said, her voice flat. If the writ has been issued, ma'am, that means the judgment is final. The sheriff handles the lockout. The court is done with it. I understand that is what the file says, I said, keeping the desperation out of my throat. However, I was never served with this lawsuit. The first time I learned of this action was 30 minutes ago when the deputy arrived. The proof of service in the file lists an address I have not lived at in 10 years. I am the owner of this property, not a tenant. The typing stopped. There was a pause, the silence of a bureaucrat processing a deviation from the norm. You are claiming improper service? Linda asked. I am claiming fraudulent service, I corrected gently but firmly. I need to file an emergency motion to vacate the default judgment and a request for an immediate stay of execution. I have the deed to the property and proof of my residence here. Well, Linda sighed, you can come in and file an ex parte application, but the judge's calendar is full this morning. Usually, ex parte hearings are at 1:30 in the afternoon. 1:30 will be too late, I said. The lockout is scheduled for 12. I need to get a stay signed before noon. I cannot promise the judge will see it in time, Linda said, retreating to protocol. You can file the papers, but I understand you cannot promise, I said. But if I bring the filing fee and the motion right now, can you at least flag it for the clerk in Department 4? If the judge sees the discrepancy in the service address, he might sign the temporary stay in chambers. A beat of silence. I was asking her to do extra work. I was asking her to care. Bring your proof, Linda said, her voice softening just a fraction. Bring the deed. Bring a utility bill with the correct address. If you get here by 8:30, I will put it on top of the pile. Thank you, Linda, I said. I am on my way. I hung up. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I had a chance. It was a sliver of a chance, but it was there. I grabbed the entire accordion folder. I grabbed my laptop. I grabbed my purse. As I rushed toward the front door, I stopped. I remembered the moment on the porch with Deputy Larkin. It had happened fast. In the gap between him handing me the papers and him turning to leave, I had asked him for the time, just to slow him down, to let him see that I was not the drug addict or squatter he usually dealt with. He had looked at me, really looked at me, and he must have seen the terror behind my mask of compliance. He had reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. Not his business card, but a generic card with a number handwritten on the back. Civil Enforcement Unit. I cannot give you legal advice, he had said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper. And I cannot stop a court order. But if you get a stay, if you get a judge to sign a piece of paper saying, stop. He had tapped the card with his thumb. Text a photo of the signed order to this number, he had said. Do not wait for the clerk to fax it to the station. That takes hours. You text it to me. If I see a judge's signature, I stand down. He had given me a lifeline. He knew. He knew something about this smelled rotten. I checked my pocket to make sure the card was there. It was. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning sun was bright now, harsh and revealing. The dew on the grass was evaporating. The neighborhood was waking up. A sprinkler system hissed to life 2 houses down. I locked the door behind me. I checked it twice. I turned to walk toward my car, which was parked in the driveway. Going somewhere. Scarlett? The voice came from the sidewalk. It was a voice that used to sing me lullabies. A voice that used to tell me I was special. A voice that now sounded like grinding gears. I stopped. I turned my head slowly. Gwen and Hector had not left. Or if they had circled back. They were standing by the mailbox, right at the edge of my property line. My mother was holding a travel mug of coffee, looking for all the world like a concerned neighbor stopping by for a chat. My father stood with his hands in his pockets, rocking back on his heels. They were trying to box me in. They wanted a scene. They wanted me to scream at them in the front yard so the neighbors would look out their windows and see the crazy daughter yelling at her elderly parents. They wanted witnesses to my instability. "We just wanted to make sure you were packing," my father said, his tone dripping with fake concern. "We brought some boxes in the trunk if you need them. We do not want your things to get thrown on the curb. Honey, it is for the best," my mother added, taking a sip of her coffee. "You have been looking so stressed lately. You can't handle a house this size. We are just trying to help you downsize. You will thank us later." The gaslighting was so potent I could almost smell it. It smelled like cheap perfume and rot. They were rewriting reality in real time, framing their theft as an act of charity. I gripped the handle of my fireproof folder until my knuckles turned white. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to lash out. I wanted to scream about the fake service. I wanted to scream about Juniper Trace. I wanted to ask how they could look at their own child and see nothing but a piggy bank to be smashed open. But I looked at the Ring camera mounted beside my front door. The blue light was solid. It was recording. And I looked at them. Really looked at them. They looked eager. They were waiting for the explosion. They needed the explosion to justify what they had done. I forced my face into a mask of absolute bored indifference. I channeled the coldest, most bureaucratic version of myself, the auditor who finds the embezzlement and does not blink. I walked past them. I did not stop. I did not break my stride. "I am not packing," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Scarlett, be reasonable," my father called out, stepping into my path, trying to physically block me from my car door. "The sheriff is coming back. Don't make a scene." I stopped inches from him. I looked him dead in the eye. "There is no scene. Hector," I said, using his first name. He flinched. "There is only paperwork." I held up the folder. "You filed a piece of paper that says I live at Juniper Trace," I said. "I am going to the courthouse to give the judge a piece of paper that proves I don't." My mother's smile faltered. "You can't." "I will let the court look at the papers," I said. Cutting her off, I sidestepped my father, opened my car door, and slid into the driver's seat. I slammed the door, locking it instantly. As I keyed the ignition, I saw them in the rear-view mirror. They were not smiling anymore. They were looking at each other. And for the first time that morning, they looked afraid. I shifted into reverse and backed out of the driveway. I had 3 hours and 45 minutes. I drove toward the courthouse, not as a daughter, but as a plaintiff in the making. The audit had begun. The Redwood County Civil Courthouse was a building designed to make you feel small. It was a brutalist block of concrete and gray glass sitting in the center of town, a fortress where lives were dismantled and rearranged in 15-minute increments. I arrived at 7:45, 15 minutes before the doors officially unlocked, joining a line of people who looked like they had not slept in days. The air inside the lobby. Once I passed through the metal detectors and the gauntlet of security guards who looked at every purse like it held a bomb, smelled of government work. It was a specific cocktail of scents. Stale coffee that had been burning on a hot plate since dawn, damp paper, floor wax, and the metallic tang of high anxiety. It was the breath of procedure, I knew this smell. I respected this smell. It was the scent of a system that functioned on rules. And right now, rules were the only weapon I had left. I took the elevator to the third floor, the civil division. My heels clicked against the linoleum. A sharp, rhythmic sound that echoed in the quiet hallway. I clutched my fireproof accordion folder to my chest. It felt heavy, not just with paper, but with the weight of the truth I had to force someone to look at. The clerk's window was still shuttered with a metal grate. I stood there, watching the digital clock on the wall tick over from 7:59 to 8 o'clock. Exactly on the hour. The grate rolled up with a clatter. Behind the glass sat a woman who could only be Linda. She had the weary, intelligent eyes of someone who had heard every lie ever invented by a desperate litigant. She was arranging a stack of files, her movements efficient and practiced. "Good morning," I said. "I called earlier. Scarlett Diaz." Linda looked up. Her expression was neutral, but there was a flicker of recognition. She adjusted her glasses and reached for a small pile of paperwork she had set aside on her desk. "The eviction," she said. It was not a question. "Case CV 24000918. That is the one," I said. "I am here to file an ex parte application for a stay of execution and a motion to vacate default judgment." I slid my ID, my original grant deed, and my most recent property tax bill under the glass partition. Linda took the ID and glanced at it, then pulled the case file toward her. She opened it. I watched her eyes scan the pages. I knew what she was looking for. She was looking for the proof of service. She needed to see how the plaintiffs claimed they had notified me. Her finger traced down the page, and then it stopped. Her eyebrows knitted together. She leaned closer to the document, squinting slightly, as if she could not quite believe what she was reading. "Wait a minute," she muttered, mostly to herself. She looked up at me, then back at the document. "The process server lists the person who accepted service as—" She paused, double-checking the name against the plaintiff's line on the file jacket. "Gwen Diaz." "Yes," I said, keeping my voice level. "My mother, who is also the plaintiff suing me." Linda let out a short, dry huff of breath that might have been a laugh in a different context. In the world of civil procedure, this was the punchline to a very bad joke. A plaintiff cannot accept service on behalf of the defendant they are suing. It creates an immediate, blinding conflict of interest. It is the legal equivalent of playing tennis against yourself and declaring yourself the winner. "And she accepted it at an address on Juniper Trace," Linda noted, flipping a page. "I have not lived at Juniper Trace for 10 years, I said. "I live at the property in question, 78 Briar Glen, where I was sleeping this morning when the sheriff showed up." Linda looked at me. For a moment, the barrier between bureaucrat and human lowered. She saw the situation for what it was, a dirty trick played by people who thought the court was stupid. She reached for a yellow highlighter from her cup. She turned the proof of service document around and slid it under the glass toward me, along with the highlighter. "The judge is going to read this file in about an hour," Linda said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial volume. "He has 50 files to get through. Sometimes details get missed." She tapped the paper. "If I were you, I would make sure the line where the plaintiff accepted service for the defendant is very, very visible." I took the highlighter. I capped it and drew a thick, neon yellow line through the section listing Gwen Diaz as the recipient of the papers. I highlighted the address on Juniper Trace. I highlighted the date. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," Linda said. She turned back to her computer and typed something. "You need to see the exhibits. The default judgment was granted because the complaint included a prima facie evidence of a landlord-tenant relationship. The judge saw a lease, so he signed the eviction." "There is no lease," I said. "I own the home." "Well," Linda said, hitting the print button. "They filed one." The printer behind her whirred to life. She grabbed a single sheet of paper and slid it to me. I looked down. It was a standard, store-bought rental agreement, the kind you can download from the internet for $5. It was dated 2 years ago. It listed Gwen and Hector Diaz as landlords and Scarlett Diaz as tenant. It outlined a monthly rent of $1,500. And at the bottom, there was a signature, Scarlett Diaz. I stared at the ink. It was a looping, childish scrawl. It looked nothing like my signature. My signature was sharp, angular, evolved from years of signing thousands of compliance audits. This looked like someone had practiced writing my name with their non-dominant hand. "This is a forgery," I said. The temperature in my blood dropped another few degrees. "I figured," Linda said. "But to the court. Until you contest it, it is a fact." This was an escalation I had not anticipated. Improper service was a procedural trick. Forging a contract was a felony. My parents were not just trying to manipulate the system. They were committing crimes to do it. They had crossed a line that they could never uncross. "Here," Linda said, sliding a thick packet of forms under the glass. "Motion to stay, motion to vacate, declaration in support. Fill them out. Be specific. Do not be emotional. State the facts." I did not sign this. I do not live there. I own the home. Attach copies of your deed and your ID. I took the forms. "Is the judge in?" "Judge Sutter is in chambers," Linda said. "He is reviewing emergency applications at 8:30. You have 20 minutes to get this back to me if you want it on his desk before he takes the bench." I nodded. I turned and walked to one of the narrow wooden tables along the wall. I sat down. I uncapped my black pen. My hand wanted to shake. The rage wanted to travel from my chest down to my fingers and rip the paper apart. I wanted to write in all caps. I wanted to write. "They are liars." But I breathed in. I breathed out. I visualized the cool, gray interior of my office at Crestline. I began to write. I, Scarlett Diaz, declare under penalty of perjury. I wrote with precision. I printed my letters clearly. I referenced the exhibits I was attaching as Exhibit A, the deed, and Exhibit B, the real signature on my driver's license. I explained the timeline. I explained the ghost address. I stated simply and unequivocally that the rental agreement was a fabrication. I did not use exclamation points. I did not use adjectives like evil or cruel. I let the discrepancy between the dates and the addresses do the screaming for me. I finished the last page at 8:25. I assembled the packet, stapling the copies of my evidence to the back. I walked back to the window. Linda was helping another man, but she saw me coming and held up a finger to him. She took my packet. She pulled out a heavy rubber stamp. Thunk, filed. February 3rd, 2026. Superior Court of California. The sound of that stamp was the most satisfying thing I had heard all morning. It was the sound of a shield going up. It was the sound of my voice entering the record. "I am sending this up to Department 4 right now," Linda said. She put the packet into a red folder marked Urgent. "Go upstairs. Wait outside the courtroom. The judicial assistant will come out if the judge signs it." "Thank you, Linda," I said again. "Good luck," she said. And this time, she looked like she meant it. I walked to the elevators, but they were too slow. So I took the stairs. I took them 2 at a time, my legs burning, the physical exertion helping to burn off the adrenaline that was pooling in my muscles. Department 4 was at the end of a long hallway on the 2nd floor. The benches outside were already filling up with lawyers in cheap suits and anxious defendants clutching traffic tickets. I stood by the double doors. I did not sit. I could not sit. 10 minutes passed, then 20. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was 8:50. 3 hours and 10 minutes until the lockout. The door to Department 4 opened. A woman in a sharp blazer walked out. She was holding a clipboard and a stack of files. This was the judicial assistant. In the hierarchy of the court, she was the gatekeeper. She controlled who saw the wizard. "Diaz versus Diaz?" she called out, scanning the hallway. "Here," I said, stepping forward. She looked at me. Her expression was unreadable, professional, but there was a tightness around her eyes. She held a file in her hand. My file, with the red urgent folder Linda had prepared. "You are the defendant?" she asked. "I am," I said. Scarlett Diaz. Judge Sutter is reading your declaration right now, she said. She lowered her voice, stepping closer to me so the lawyers on the bench could not hear. He sees the service issue. He sees the address discrepancy. Will he sign the stay? I asked. The air felt thin. The assistant hesitated. She looked down at the file, then back at me. He is inclined to grant the stay based on the improper service, she said. But you need to know something. The plaintiffs, your parents, they filed a supplemental exhibit this morning, just as the court opened. My stomach turned over. What kind of exhibit? They knew you might contest the lease, the assistant said. So they submitted another document to bolster their claim that they own the property. That is impossible, I said. I have the deed. They filed a deed too, she said softly. I froze. What? They filed a copy of a quitclaim deed, she said. Dated 2 weeks ago, recorded with the county. It shows you transferring the title of 78 Briar Glen to Gwen and Hector Diaz for a consideration of $10. The hallway seemed to tilt. A quitclaim deed, a document that legally renounces ownership. I never signed a quitclaim deed, I whispered. I have never signed over my house. The assistant looked at me with a mixture of pity and warning. It has a notary seal, she said. It looks valid on its face. That is why the judge is taking so long. This isn't just an eviction case anymore. Ms. Diaz, if that deed is recorded, they didn't just pretend to be your landlords. She paused, letting the weight of the reality settle on me. They legally stole the title. I leaned back against the wall, the cold plaster seeping through my coat. They had not just forged a rental agreement. That was amateur hour. They had forged a deed. They had gone to the county recorder. They had faked a notarization. They had stolen the house on paper before they ever sent the sheriff to the door. This was not a dispute. This was a heist. The judge is going to grant the stay, the assistant said, her voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. Because the service was clearly bad, he is going to stop the lockout for today. But he is setting an emergency hearing. You are going to have to prove that deed is fake. And proving a notarized document is fake is difficult. I will prove it, I said. My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. Get ready, she said, handing me a copy of the stay order the judge had just signed. The ink was still wet. Because they are not just coming for your keys. They are coming for your identity. I took the paper. I had the stay. I had stopped the clock. But as I looked at the signature of the judge, I realized the war had just expanded. I wasn't just fighting to stay in my house. I was fighting a crime that had already been committed, sealed, and filed in the public record. I looked at the assistant. Thank you. She nodded and went back inside the courtroom. I stood alone in the hallway. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the stay order. I texted it to the number Deputy Larkin had given me. Judge signed stay. Writ recall ordered. Do not lock out. I hit send. Then I stared at the phone. My parents had forged a deed. They had actually done it. I pushed off the wall. The shock was gone. The cold. Hard anger was back, and it was sharper than before. Okay, I said to the silence. You want to talk about deeds? Let's go to the recorder's office. I turned and walked toward the stairs. I had won the morning. Now I had to win the war. A quitclaim deed is the legal equivalent of a suicide note for property ownership. It is a document that says, quite literally, I quit my claim to this land. It is the fastest, cleanest way to transfer a title. It strips you of your rights, your equity, and your history in a single page. If that document is real, you have given your house away. If it is fake, someone has committed a felony that carries a prison sentence of up to 4 years. Standing in the hallway of the Redwood County Courthouse, the judicial assistant's words hit me like a splash of ice water. They filed a copy of a quitclaim deed, she had said. Recorded 2 weeks ago. I felt a physical chill start at the base of my skull and radiate down my spine. It was not fear. It was the cold clarity of realization. The eviction was just the distraction. The rental agreement was just the window dressing. The real crime, the actual heist, was the deed. My parents had not just tried to kick me out. They had stolen the asset out from under me while I was sleeping in it. I did not panic. Panic is for people who do not understand the rules. If the deed was genuine, I had shot myself in the foot and forgotten about it. Since I knew I had not done that, the deed was a forgery, and forgery leaves traces. Forgery requires an accomplice. "Thank you," I said to the assistant. "I am ready." She held the door to Department 4 open for me. I walked into the courtroom. It was smaller than the criminal courtrooms on TV, lined with wood paneling that had absorbed decades of petty disputes. The air was still and smelled of floor wax. There were only a few people in the gallery, mostly lawyers checking their phones, but at the counsel table on the right, they were waiting. Gwen and Hector Diaz sat side by side, their posture perfect. My mother was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, though I knew for a fact her tear ducts were as dry as the Mojave Desert. My father had his hand on her shoulder, playing the role of the stoic protector, and sitting next to them was a man I did not know, but immediately recognized by type. He was silver-haired, tanned, and wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He had a leather briefcase open in front of him and was arranging papers with manicured hands. Warren Klein. I saw his name on the notepad. He was a high-end real estate litigator. My parents, who claimed they were broke, who were allegedly so desperate they needed to liquidate my house, had somehow found the funds to hire a shark like Warren Klein. That meant there was money behind this. Real money. Someone was funding their play. I walked to the defendant's table on the left. I was alone. I placed my fireproof accordion folder on the table. It looked battered and utilitarian next to Klein's sleek leather case. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Marianne Sutter swept into the room. She was a woman in her 60s with short, gray steel hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She did not look like someone who suffered fools. She looked like she wanted to get through her docket and go to lunch. "Be seated," she said, sitting down and opening the file in front of her. "Calling case CV 2400918, Diaz versus Diaz, an ex parte application to stay execution of writ." "Good morning, Your Honor," Warren Klein said, standing up smoothly. His voice was rich, projected from the diaphragm. "Warren Klein for the plaintiffs, Gwen and Hector Diaz." "Good morning," I said, standing up. My voice was thinner, but steady. "Scarlett Diaz, defendant, representing myself." Judge Sutter looked at me over her glasses. "You are representing yourself in a title dispute involving a recorded deed? That is bold. Ms. Diaz." "It is necessary, Your Honor," I said. "I only learned of this lawsuit 3 hours ago." "Objection to the characterization," Klein said, cutting in gently, like a disappointed uncle. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs are the parents of the defendant. This is a tragic family matter. My clients have been trying to assist their daughter for months. The eviction is a last resort to protect the asset." "Protect the asset?" Judge Sutter asked, raising an eyebrow. "Ms. Diaz has been struggling," Klein said, lowering his voice to a respectful hush. He gestured toward me without looking at me. "There have been issues of instability. My clients, out of love and a desire to preserve the family legacy, accepted the transfer of the property 2 weeks ago via quitclaim deed to ensure the house was not lost to her. Mismanagement. The lease back to her was a way to let her stay, but she has refused to honor the terms or communicate." My mother let out a small, audible sniffle. It was a masterclass in manipulation. They were painting a picture of a mentally unstable daughter and 2 heroic, self-sacrificing parents who were forced to take control. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but I clamped down on it. If I yelled, I proved them right. If I cried, I proved them right. "Your Honor," I said, "there is no mismanagement. I work in corporate compliance. I have a credit score of 780, and I have never transferred my property to anyone." Judge Sutter waved a hand. "Let us start with the procedural issue. Ms. Diaz is asking for a stay based on improper service. Mr. Klein, I am looking at the proof of service. Yes, Your Honor, Klein said. Service was effected on January 15th, at 78 Juniper Trace, Judge Sutter read. Is that the defendant's address? It is a secondary address associated with the family, Klein said smoothly. Given Ms. Diaz's transient nature lately, my clients believed she could be reached there. I have lived at 78 Briar Glen for 3 years, I said, cutting in. I have proof of residency here. I held up my utility bill and driver's license. Juniper Trace is an apartment my parents rented 10 years ago. I haven't set foot there in a decade. Judge Sutter looked at Klein. Counsel, why was service attempted at an old address when the eviction is for the Briar Glen property? If you are evicting her from Briar Glen, presumably you know she lives at Briar Glen. Klein hesitated. It was a small stumble. There were safety concerns. Your Honor, attempting service at the home was deemed volatile. So you served her at an apartment she doesn't live at? Sutter asked. She flipped the page. And who accepted the service? The courtroom went quiet. The proof of service says substituted service on Jane Doe, adult female occupant. Judge Sutter read. She looked up. And then in the notes, it identifies the recipient as Gwen Diaz. Judge Sutter took off her glasses. She looked at my mother, then at Klein. Mr. Klein, the judge said, her voice dropping an octave. Did the plaintiff accept service on behalf of the defendant? Your Honor, technically, Klein began, opening a law book. Under Code of Civil Procedure Section 415. Do not recite the code to me, Judge Sutter snapped. Do not read me the book. Tell me why the woman suing the defendant is the one who signed for the papers. That is a fundamental conflict of interest. How can the defendant be notified if the person notifying her is the one trying to kick her out? My client was trying to ensure the papers were safe, Klein said, his polish starting to crack. She was acting as a responsible party. She was acting as the plaintiff, Sutter corrected. She looked at me. Ms. Diaz, when did you find out about this case? At 6:03 this morning, Your Honor, I said. When Deputy Larkin knocked on my door, I have never seen the complaint. I have never seen the summons. I believe you, Judge Sutter said. Klein shifted his weight. Your Honor, even if service was irregular, the underlying facts remain. We have a recorded quitclaim deed. The title has transferred. Ms. Diaz is a tenant at sufferance. The default judgment should stand because the ownership is clear. The ownership is the problem, I said. I pulled the copy of the deed the assistant had given me out of the file. I did not sign this deed. It is notarized, Klein said, pointing a finger at the paper. It is a recorded public instrument. You cannot just say, I didn't do it. That is the strongest evidence in this room. Judge Sutter turned her gaze to me. He is right. Ms. Diaz, a notarized deed carries a presumption of validity. You are alleging forgery? I am alleging fraud, I said. I am alleging that I was not present when this document was notarized. I am alleging that my signature was forged. That is a serious accusation, Sutter said. You are accusing your parents of a felony. I am, I said. I looked at my parents. My father looked away. My mother stared right at me, her eyes hard and shiny like marbles. Your Honor, Klein interrupted, this is exactly the instability we spoke of. She is lashing out. She signed that deed in front of a notary public 2 weeks ago because she needed money to cover debts. Now she is regretting it. I have no debts, I said, and I have badge logs from my office that can prove my location every minute of the day. Judge Sutter held up a hand. The room fell silent. She looked at the deed again. She looked at the service of process again. The service is defective, Judge Sutter ruled. I am vacating the default judgment immediately. The writ of possession is recalled. The lockout is canceled. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. However, Sutter continued, that leaves us with the issue of title. Mr. Klein has a recorded deed. Mrs. Diaz claims forgery. This is now a question of fact that goes beyond a simple eviction. We move for an immediate trial, Klein said. My clients are suffering financial harm every day she remains in the property, and I move for an investigation into the notary, I said. Judge Sutter looked at the signature on the deed copy. Who is the notary? She asked. Tanya Rourke, Klein said. A reputable mobile notary. Then let's hear from her, Judge Sutter said. She grabbed her gavel. I am setting an evidentiary hearing for 48 hours from now, Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. Your Honor, that is too soon, Klein protested. We need time to prepare. You filed an eviction on a 24-hour notice based on bad service, Sutter said, her voice sharp. You seem to like things moving fast, so we will move fast. She looked directly at Klein, and then at my parents. I am issuing a judicial subpoena for Tanya Rourke, Judge Sutter said. She is to appear in this courtroom on Thursday, and she is to bring her official notary journal. I want to see the thumbprint. I want to see the ID she recorded. If Ms. Diaz signed that deed, her thumbprint will be in that book. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It shifted from a civil debate to a criminal inquiry. My father went pale. I saw it happen. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and old. My mother's hand tightened on her purse until her knuckles were white. A notary journal is the black box of a transaction, in California. For a deed affecting real property, a thumbprint is mandatory. If I wasn't there, there is no print, or there is a fake print, or there is someone else's print. If the journal is not produced, Judge Sutter warned, I will draw an adverse inference that the deed is void. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, Klein said. He was not smiling anymore. He was looking at his clients with a new expression. Suspicion. Thursday, 9 Judge Sutter said. Ms. Diaz, you remain in the home until then, but do not damage the property. I would never damage my own home, I said. Judge Sutter banged the gavel. I gathered my papers. My hands were shaking again, but this time it was from the adrenaline crash. I had bought myself 48 hours. I turned to leave. I had to pass the plaintiff's table. Warren Klein was whispering furiously to my father. You told me the paperwork was solid. What is in that journal? My father didn't answer. He looked at me. There was no love in his eyes. There was only the terrifying realization that the prey had turned around and bitten back. See you Thursday, I said to them. I walked out of the courtroom. The air in the hallway felt lighter, cleaner. I checked my phone. I had a text from Deputy Larkin. Received stay. Lockout canceled. You are safe for today. I wasn't safe. I knew that. I had just cornered two desperate people and backed them against a wall of criminal liability. They were not going to give up. They were going to get dangerous. But as I walked toward the elevator, I felt a grim satisfaction. They had tried to bury me in paper. Now, I was going to use their own paper, the notary journal, to dig their graves. I had 48 hours to build the rest of the case, and I knew exactly where to start. I needed to find out who Tanya Rourke was, and why she had signed a lie. The sunlight hitting the pavement outside the courthouse was blinding, a sharp contrast to the dim, wood-paneled lighting of Department 4. I stood on the concrete steps for a moment, not to bask in the warmth, but to perform the final procedural check that would ensure my physical safety for the next 48 hours. A court order is only as good as the person enforcing it. And right now, Deputy Larkin was the only thing standing between me and a locksmith drill. I pulled out my phone and dialed the direct line to the Civil Enforcement Unit. The number on the back of the card Larkin had slipped me. It rang twice before a dispatcher picked up. I kept my voice flat and clinical. I identified myself and stated clearly that an emergency stay had been granted by Judge Sutter. I did not ask them to believe me. I told them I had already texted the image of the signed order to the deputy. There was a pause on the line, the sound of keys clacking, and then the dispatcher returned. She confirmed that Deputy Larkin had received the image and had officially logged a stand-down status on the eviction. The writ was frozen. The trucks were called off. I hung up the phone and let out a breath that rattled in my chest. I had stopped the bleeding, but I had not cured the wound. My parents had a recorded deed. In the eyes of the county, they owned my house. Until I expunged that record, I was living in a property that legally belonged to the people trying to destroy me. I walked to my car, unlocked the door, and got in. I did not drive home. Going home now would just mean sitting in a room full of anxiety. I needed to go to the source of the infection. I drove 4 blocks down to the county recorder's office. If the courthouse is where the battles happen, the recorder's office is where the ammunition is stored. It is a quiet, dusty place filled with bound volumes and computer terminals. Smelling faintly of ozone and old paper, I took a ticket and waited. When my number was called, I walked up to the counter. The clerk was a man in his 50s with thick glasses and the meticulous, slow-moving demeanor of someone who enjoyed finding errors in other people's work. His name tag read, Harold. "I need to file a fraud alert on a parcel," I said, placing my ID and the court stay order on the counter. "And I need to pull the metadata for a specific document recorded 2 weeks ago." Harold looked at the court order, his eyebrows raising slightly as he saw the judge's signature. He typed in the parcel number for 78 Briar Glen. "We do not determine validity here," Harold recited, a standard disclaimer. "We just record what is submitted." "I understand," I said, "but I am telling you the deed recorded on January 18th is a forgery. I want a formal fraud alert placed on the file, so that if anyone tries to take out a mortgage or sell the property against this deed, they get flagged." Harold nodded and handed me a form. While I filled it out, I asked him to pull up the digital scan of the quitclaim deed. "I need to see the intake information," I said. "I need to know how it was delivered. Was it mailed? Was it e-recorded by a title company? Or was it a walk-in?" Harold tapped a few keys and turned the monitor so I could see. "It was a counter walk-in," he said. "Submitted in person at 2:15 in the afternoon on January 18th. I stared at the screen. 2:15 in the afternoon, on a Tuesday. "Can you zoom in on the notary seal?" I asked. Harold clicked the mouse, and the image of the stamp expanded. It was a standard California notary seal. Tanya Rourke. Commission number 239456. "Wait," Harold said. He leaned forward, his nose almost touching the screen. "That is odd." "What is it?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "Look at the commission number," he said, pointing a pen at the screen. "The 4th digit, it looks like a 4, but the ink density is different. See how the top line is slightly heavier?" I squinted. He was right. The line looked jagged, as if someone had taken a pen and manually altered a digit on the stamp before pressing it down. Or perhaps the stamp itself was damaged and they had tried to fill it in. "It looks like it might have been a 1 originally," Harold muttered. "Altering a commission number is highly irregular. If the stamp is worn, you buy a new one. You do not draw on it." "Can I get a high-resolution print of that?" I asked. "And a certified copy of the intake receipt showing it was a walk-in?" "I can do that," Harold said. He seemed invested now. He liked a puzzle. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the recorder's office with a certified evidence packet. I had a timeline. I had a method of delivery. Someone had physically walked into that office at 2:15 in the afternoon to steal my house, and I had a suspicion about the notary stamp. It was sloppy. It was desperate. My next stop was the hardware store. I bought 3 high-security deadbolts, the kind that cost $200 each and require a code card to duplicate the key. I bought 4 wireless security cameras with cloud storage. I bought a reinforced strike plate for the front door frame. I drove home. The house looked the same as it had when I left, but it felt different. It felt compromised. I parked in the driveway and looked across the street. My parents were gone. The street was quiet. I spent the next 3 hours turning my home into a fortress. I removed the old locks, the ones my father had helped me install years ago. I threw them into the trash bin with a satisfying clatter. I drilled new holes. I screwed in the strike plates with 3-inch screws that went deep into the studs. I mounted a camera above the front door, 1 above the garage, and 2 covering the back patio. I synced them to my phone. I set the motion sensitivity to high. I was not doing this because I was afraid they would break in tonight. I was doing it because from this moment on, nothing in my life was going to happen without a record. If the wind blew a leaf across my porch, I wanted a timestamp of it. Once the physical perimeter was secure, I sat down at my dining room table and opened my laptop. It was time to secure the digital perimeter. I needed an alibi. The deed had been notarized and recorded on January 18th. The notary journal would claim I was standing in front of Tanya Rourke at some point that day signing the document. The recorder's metadata said the deed was dropped off at 2:15. I opened my work email and composed a message to the Director of Security at Crestline Compliance Solutions. Subject: Urgent, Internal Investigation/Preservation of Records. Dear Marcus, I am currently involved in a legal dispute regarding identity theft and fraud. I need to formally request a full export of my physical access logs for the date of January 18th, 2026. Specifically, I need 1. Badge swipe data for the main lobby turnstiles. 2. Keycard access logs for the elevator and the 4th floor secure suite. 3. Parking garage gate scans for my vehicle. Parking gate scans for my vehicle. 4. Video surveillance footage of the employee entrance between 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening on that date. Please consider this a formal preservation request. If the footage is on a 30-day overwrite cycle, I am asking you to pull it to a permanent hold immediately. I pressed send and let the silence do the talking. I knew Marcus. He was a former military police officer who treated the corporate security of our mid-sized firm like it was the Pentagon. He would not ask questions, but he would act fast. 20 minutes later, my phone pinged with a reply. Scarlett, request received. I have pulled the logs. You were in the building. First badge in at 7:45, last badge out at 6:15, no exits in between. I am burning the video to a secure drive now. The footage shows you at your desk at 2:15. Nobody can say you were anywhere else. We have your back. I let out a long exhale. The footage shows you at your desk at 2:15. That was the nail in the coffin. If I was at my desk at 2:15, I could not have been at the recorder's office handing in a deed. And if I was in the building all day, I could not have met a notary across town to sign it. I printed Marcus's email. I printed the badge logs he attached. I went to my office and took out a fresh 3-ring binder. I labeled the spine with a label maker. Diaz versus Diaz evidence. I was not going to walk into court on Thursday and tell a story. Stories are messy. Stories are subjective. I was going to walk in with an index of undeniable realities. I created tabs. Tab 1, the fraudulent service, the highlight on the Gwen Diaz signature. Tab 2, the forged lease, the signature mismatch. Tab 3, the altered deed, the blown-up image of the commission number. Tab 4, the alibi, the Crestline badge logs and Marcus's affidavit. Tab 5, the timeline, a spreadsheet comparing the official story against the metadata. I punched holes in the pages. The sound of the hole puncher was rhythmic, calming. Chunk, chunk, chunk. I was building a wall. Every piece of paper was a brick. I was sealing myself in, and I was sealing them out. By the time I finished, the sun had gone down. The house was dark, save for the blue glow of the monitor and the single lamp on my desk. I felt exhausted, but it was a clean exhaustion. It was the feeling of having done the work. I went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. My phone, sitting on the counter, buzzed. I looked at the screen. It was a text message. The number was not saved in my contacts. It was a local area code, but not one I recognized. I picked it up and opened the message. You think you are clever with your little binder and your judge, but paper burns. You should have packed when you had the chance. We are not playing by your rules anymore. I stared at the gray bubble. There was no signature. There was no name. But I knew the voice. It wasn't my mother's passive-aggressive tone. It wasn't my father's blustering anger. This was sharper. This sounded like the person who had altered the commission number. This sounded like the person who had paid the rush fee at the recorder's office. They knew I had won the day. They knew the legal path was closing for them. So now, they were signaling a shift. They were done trying to trick the court. They were moving to intimidation. I did not reply. I took a screenshot of the text. I emailed it to myself. I printed it out. I walked back to my office and opened the binder. I created a new tab at the very back. Tab 6. Threats and harassment. I punched the hole in the paper and snapped the ring shut. "You are right," I said to the empty room, my voice echoing off the walls I had just fought to keep. "We are not playing by my rules. We are playing by the rules of evidence, and you just gave me another exhibit." I turned off the light. But I did not go to sleep. I watched the camera feed on my phone, waiting to see who would be the first to step into the frame. The text message from the unknown number was still burning a hole in my digital consciousness when the motion sensor on my front porch light clicked on. It was 8:45 in the evening. The darkness outside was absolute, swallowed by the heavy cloud cover that had rolled in after sunset, but the harsh LED floodlight illuminated my front stoop with clinical brightness. My phone buzzed in my hand. Motion detected. Front door. I did not need to look at the feed to know who it was. The cadence of the knock gave them away. It was not the authoritative thud of the sheriff, nor the polite rap of a delivery driver. It was a frantic, entitled pounding, a rhythm I had internalized since childhood. It was the sound of my parents demanding entry into a space they felt they owned by birthright. "Scarlett, open this door." My father's voice was muffled by the solid oak and the new high-density weather stripping I had installed, but the anger in it vibrated through the frame. I stood in the hallway, 10 feet back from the door. The house was dark behind me. I had turned off the interior lights so I could see out without being seen, a trick I had learned from my security audits. I checked the lock. The new deadbolt I had installed 3 hours ago was engaged. The strike plate was reinforced. They were not getting in unless they had a battering ram. I swiped open my phone and tapped the voice memos app. I hit the red record button. Then I tapped the video camera icon on the security app, ensuring the cloud backup was active. "We know you are in there, Scarlett." My mother's voice joined in. It was higher, tighter than usual. "The car is in the driveway. Stop being childish." I took a step closer, but I did not unlock the door. I placed my hand against the cool wood, feeling the vibrations of my father's fist hitting the other side. "I am recording this interaction," I said. My voice was loud enough to carry through the door, but I kept it devoid of the tremor I felt in my knees. "Anything you say is being preserved for the court hearing on Thursday." The pounding stopped instantly. Silence hung heavy for 3 seconds. They were recalibrating. They knew about the recording now. "We just want to talk," my father said, his tone shifting from demand to a forced, gritty reasonability. "We are a family. Scarlett, we need to settle this like a family, not in front of a judge who does not know us." "You sued me," I said, leaning my forehead against the door. "You hired a process server. You filed a fraudulent eviction. You forged a deed. That is not family. That is litigation. And I do not speak to opposing counsel without a lawyer present." "We did not forge anything," my father yelled, his temper snapping the leash of his prudence. "You signed that paper. You know you did." "I was at work." "Hector," I said, using his name again to keep the distance between us. "I have the logs. I have the video. I was nowhere near a notary." "It does not matter," he shouted back. And then he said the words that would hang him. "It does not matter where you think you were. The notary is going to say you signed it. Tanya will stand there and say she saw you do it. Do you hear me? You cannot beat a witness." I watched the audio waveform on my phone screen spike as he yelled. He had just admitted it. He wasn't saying you signed it. He was saying, "The notary will say you signed it." It was a prediction of perjury, not a recollection of fact. It was a slip of the tongue born of arrogance. "Is that a threat?" I asked, keeping my voice low, inviting him to say more. "It is reality," he spat. "Hector, stop," my mother hissed. I could hear the rustle of fabric as she likely grabbed his arm. Then her voice came through the wood, soft, wheedling, the voice she used when she wanted me to co-sign a loan or forgive a missed birthday. It was the weaponized sweetness that had kept me in line for 30 years. "Scarlett, honey," she said, "please, you are making this so much bigger than it needs to be. We are not trying to hurt you. We are trying to secure the future, for all of us." "By making me homeless?" I asked. "No, no," she said quickly. "We would never let you be homeless. We would rent you an apartment, a nice one, but we need the equity. Don't you see? You are destroying the family's future over a few pieces of paper. Why are you being so selfish? Why do you want to see us ruined?" "Ruined?" I latched onto the word. "Why would you be ruined? What did you do, Mom?" We have an opportunity," she stammered. "A business deal. It is a sure thing, but we need the capital now. If we miss this window, we lose everything." "Who is the deal with?" I asked. "It is complicated," she said. "But the investors, they are waiting. We promised them the title would be clear by the 1st of the month. They have the contracts ready. If you fight this, the deal collapses. And if the deal collapses—" Her voice trailed off, trembling with genuine terror. "If the deal collapses—" "What?" I pressed. "They are not people you say no to," my father muttered. It was barely audible, but the microphone picked it up. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Investors, contracts, not people you say no to. They hadn't just stolen the house to pay off credit cards. They had sold the house to someone else before they even legally owned it. They had likely taken an advance, a down payment from a hard money lender or some predatory flipper, promising they would deliver the deed within weeks. And now I was the roadblock in a transaction that had already been spent. "That sounds like a you problem," I said, "not a me problem." "You ungrateful little—" my father started, but my mother cut him off. "Scarlett, please," she begged. "Just sign the quitclaim. For real this time. We will give you $20,000 from the sale. You can start fresh. Just let us fix this." "I am fixing it," I said. "I am fixing the lock you tried to drill out. Go home. If you are not off my porch in 1 minute, I am calling Deputy Larkin to enforce the restraining order I am filing tomorrow." "You wouldn't," my mother whispered. "Watch me," I said. I waited. For a long, agonizing minute. There was silence. Then I heard heavy footsteps retreating down the wooden stairs. I heard a car door slam. I heard an engine rev aggressively, tires screeching against the asphalt as they sped away. I stopped the recording. My hand was shaking so hard, I almost dropped the phone. I stood there in the dark hallway, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and fear. They were desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. My father had just handed me the notary's intent to perjure herself. My mother had confirmed the existence of a third-party pressure, the investors. I turned away from the door and walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. My throat felt like sandpaper. As I stood by the sink, looking out the side window into the darkness of the yard, I saw a flashlight beam bounce across the fence line. My muscles tensed. Had they come back? Had they circled around the back? I watched the beam. It wasn't erratic. It was steady. It moved along the hedge and then dipped down. "Scarlett?" A voice called out from the other side of the fence. "Is that you, dear?" I relaxed. It was Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was 72 years old, lived alone, and possessed the sharpest eyes in the neighborhood. She was the unofficial watchman of Briar Glen. She noticed if you put your trash cans out an hour late. She noticed if a strange cat walked across a lawn. I unlocked the back door and stepped out onto the patio, staying in the shadows. "Mrs. Gable?" I called back softly. "I am here. Is everything okay?" Her face appeared over the top of the wooden fence, illuminated by the ambient glow of her own porch light. She was wearing a quilted gardening vest over her pajamas. "I saw the police car this morning," she said, cutting right to the chase. "And I just saw your parents peeling out of here like teenagers. Is everything all right?" "It is a bit of a family dispute," I said, euphemistically. "I am sorry about the noise." "Oh, I don't mind the noise," Mrs. Gable said. She leaned closer to the fence. I mind the company. I never liked that father of yours. He parks too close to my hydrangeas. She hesitated, then continued. I wanted to tell you something. I didn't want to intrude, but after seeing the sheriff, I thought it might be important. What is it? I asked. 2 weeks ago, she said. On a Tuesday. I remember because it was trash day. I was out front bringing my bins in. Your parents were here. You weren't home. Your car was gone. My heart skipped a beat. What time was this? Early afternoon, she said. Maybe 1:30 or 2. They were standing in your driveway. And a car pulled up, a black sedan. Very nice. Tinted windows. Who was in it? A man got out, Mrs. Gable said. Tall, bald head, wore a suit that looked too shiny. He didn't go inside. He just stood by the trunk of his car and talked to your father. Your father looked, well, he looked sweaty, even from across the street. Did they exchange anything? I asked. The man gave your father a thick envelope, Mrs. Gable said. Manila, stuffed full. And your father gave him a folder. Then the man left. Your parents left right after that, in a huge hurry. A folder, the deed, an envelope, the cash, or the down payment from the investor. Mrs. Gable, I said, my voice trembling with gratitude. Do you still have your driveway camera set up? The one that points toward the street? Oh, honey, that camera never sleeps, she said. I record everything. Cloud storage keeps it for 30 days. My grandson set it up. Could you send me the footage from that Tuesday? I asked. January 18th, around 1:30? I will send it to your email right now, she said. I knew something was fishy. That man didn't look like a friend. You are a lifesaver, I said. Truly? Lock your doors. Scarlett, she said gently, and don't let them bully you. She disappeared back into her house. 5 minutes later, my phone pinged, an email from Agnes Gable, subject, video clip. I opened the attachment. The video was grainy, but clear enough. Timestamp, January 18th, 2026, 1:38 p.m. I saw my parents' car parked in my driveway. I saw a black Mercedes pull up. I saw a man get out. He was exactly as described. Bald, shiny suit. He handed my father a thick envelope. My father handed him a blue folder. I paused the video. I zoomed in on the folder. It was blue. I ran to my office. I pulled out my own file of house documents. The folder I used for my house papers was red. But the folder my parents kept their family trust documents in? That was blue. My father had handed over the deed, or the promise of the deed, right there in the driveway, and 20 minutes later, according to the recorder's metadata, the deed was walked into the county office. This man wasn't just an investor. He was the courier. He was the one who took the forged document to the county. I saved the video to my secure cloud. I saved it to my hard drive. I saved it to a USB stick. I sat down at my desk. I opened the document I had started earlier. The chronology of facts. I added a new entry. January 18th, 1:38 p.m. Unknown male accepts folder from Hector Diaz in driveway of 78 Briar Glen. Hector Diaz accepts envelope. Witness, Agnes Gable. Evidence, video footage, January 18th, 2:15 p.m. Deed recorded at county office. Walk in. The timeline was a steel trap. I had them. I pulled up the screenshot of the threatening text message I had received earlier. We are not playing by your rules anymore. I forwarded the text to myself again, attaching the video file and the audio recording of my father yelling, "The notary is going to say you signed it." I labeled the email. Evidence packet. Draft restraining order. I looked at the clock. It was 10:30. My body was screaming for sleep. The adrenaline crash from the morning had returned with a vengeance, leaving my limbs feeling like lead. My eyes burned. They wanted me exhausted. They wanted me to be staring at the ceiling all night, terrified of the next knock, terrified of the investors, terrified of the shiny suit, They wanted me to walk into court on Thursday with dark circles under my eyes, stumbling over my words, looking like the unstable daughter they claimed I was. I stood up. I walked to the front door and checked the lock one last time. I checked the camera feed. The street was empty. I went to my bedroom. I put on my most comfortable pajamas. I turned on the white noise machine to drown out the silence of the empty house. I was not going to stay up pacing. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of stealing my peace along with my property. I climbed into bed and pulled the heavy duvet up to my chin. "Try me," I whispered to the darkness. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to slow. In 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. I fell asleep not out of exhaustion, but out of spite. I needed to be sharp tomorrow. Because tomorrow, I wasn't just building a defense, I was hunting a notary. Wednesday morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the notification chime of my secure email server. It was 7 o'clock, and I was already sitting at my kitchen table, dressed in a suit, drinking my third cup of black coffee. The house was silent, fortified by the new locks and the unblinking eyes of the cameras I had installed, but inside my head, the noise was deafening. I opened the email from Marcus, the director of security at Crestline. The subject line was simply, "Data packet, preserved." Attached was a PDF file, dense with rows and columns. I opened it, and for the first time in 24 hours, I felt the tight band around my chest loosen. It was beautiful. It was a grid of irrefutable facts. January 18th, 2026, 7:42 a.m. Badge ID 4922. Scarlett Diaz. Main lobby. Turnstile. In 7:45 a.m. Elevator bank B. Floor 4 access 12:12 p.m. Door access server room B. Biometric scan 6:18 p.m. Badge ID 4922. Scarlett Diaz. Main lobby turnstile. Out, there were no gaps. There were no unknown entries. The parking garage scans corroborated the badge data. My car had entered the structure at 7:35 in the morning and had not triggered the exit gate until 6:20 in the evening. I was in a high-security office building, surrounded by cameras and colleagues. At the exact moment my parents claimed I was standing in front of a notary signing away my birthright. Unless I had mastered the ability to bilocate, their story was physically impossible. Marcus had included a cover letter on company letterhead, formally attesting to the authenticity of the records and citing the specific retention protocols for the server data. He added a line at the bottom. Video footage of the subject at her desk at 2:15 p.m. has been isolated and burned to a secure drive, available upon subpoena. "Got you," I whispered. I printed 3 copies of the logs. The sound of the printer rhythmically spitting out the pages was the drumbeat of my counterattack. Just as I was stapling the packet, another email landed in my inbox. This one was not from a friend. It was from Gua Klein at kleinassociates.com. Warren Klein, my parents' lawyer. I clicked it open, bracing myself for legal threats. Instead, I found a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation. Dear Ms. Diaz, I am writing this morning in hopes of de-escalating the unfortunate situation before our scheduled hearing tomorrow. Your parents are deeply distressed by the rift this has caused. They are willing to overlook the aggressive behavior you displayed last night regarding the door recording. They have authorized me to offer a temporary settlement. If you agree to vacate the property voluntarily by 5 o'clock today, they will place you in a fully furnished executive apartment for 3 months. At their expense, this will allow for a cooling-off period where we can discuss the long-term asset management without the pressure of litigation. Please consider this. Staying in the house is only prolonging the pain for everyone. I laughed out loud. It was a cold, sharp sound in the empty kitchen. Cooling-off period. Asset management. It was a trap so transparent it was insulting. They did not want peace. They wanted possession. If I left the house voluntarily, even for a night, I would be surrendering my claim to occupancy. Once I was out, the investors with the shiny suits would move in, The locks would change again. The furniture would be liquidated. By the time I tried to get back in, the house would be gutted or sold to a third party who would claim they were an innocent buyer. They were terrified. The aggressive behavior he mentioned was me recording their confession. They were trying to get me out before I could present that recording to a judge. I hit reply. I did not write a paragraph. I wrote one sentence. Mr. Klein, my only settlement offer is a dismissal with prejudice and a surrender of the forged deed. Otherwise, I will see you in court. I sent it. No extra words. I grabbed my evidence binder, now thick with the weight of the truth. I had the badge logs. I had the video clip from Mrs. Gable showing the courier exchange. I had the audio of my father saying, "The notary will say you signed it." I had the blown-up photo of the altered commission number on the stamp. I drove to the courthouse. I did not park in the public lot. I parked in the structure 2 blocks away, checking my mirrors constantly to see if the black Mercedes was following me. Paranoia was no longer a disorder. It was a survival strategy. I walked into the clerk's office. Linda was there again. When she saw me, she gave a microscopic nod. "Supplemental filing," I said, sliding the heavy packet under the glass. "Declaration in support of opposition to title claim. Exhibits D through G." Linda took the packet. She flipped through the badge logs. She paused at the transcript of the audio recording. Her eyes widened slightly. "Filed," she said, stamping it with a satisfying thud. "This goes straight to Judge Sutter's chambers." "I have one more stop," I said. "I need to go back to the recorder." I left the courthouse and walked the familiar 4 blocks to the county recorder's office. Harold was at the counter, looking like he hadn't moved since yesterday. "I need the intake slip," I told him. "I need to know exactly who handed that deed to you. The metadata says walk-in, but there has to be a receipt or a log of the presenter." Harold tapped on his keyboard. "Usually for walk-ins, we just scan the document, but if there was a fee paid, yes, here." He printed out a receipt. It was a thermal slip, like a grocery store receipt, but it held the secrets of a felony. Transaction date, January 18th, 2:15 p.m. Item, grant deed recording. Fee, $40. Additional fee, $50. Rush/expedited handling. Rush fee, I noted. They had paid extra to make sure the deed was recorded instantly. Skipping the usual 3-day processing queue, they couldn't risk a delay. They needed the title clear so they could show it to the investors that same afternoon, but it was the bottom of the receipt that made my breath catch. Presenter, name/contact, QS Mobile Services, 555-0199. QS Mobile Services, I read aloud. The memory clicked into place like a puzzle piece. 6 months ago, at a family barbecue, my mother had been complaining about how hard it was to get documents signed for her business ventures. My father had mentioned a guy he met at the track. Fast guy, doesn't ask questions, runs a service called Quick Sign. It was not a coincidence. They hadn't just used a notary, they had used a fixer, a mobile service that likely specialized in documents that couldn't pass standard scrutiny. I took the receipt. "Harold, can you certify this?" "Stamp and seal," Harold said. Doing the honors, I walked out with the receipt burning a hole in my pocket. I pulled out my phone and searched for QS Mobile Services. The result was a bare-bones website, no office address, just a P.O. box and a promise. "We come to you, 24/7, any document, any time." And there, listed under staff, was the name, Tanya Rourke. This was not an impartial officer of the state. This was a hired gun with a rubber stamp. I sat in my car and opened my laptop. I had the badge logs proving I was at work. I had the receipt proving a courier service submitted the deed. I had the witness video proving the handoff. Now I had to prepare for the final showdown. The hearing was set for tomorrow morning. Judge Sutter had ordered Tanya Rourke to appear with her journal. I opened a new document, Cross-Examination Strategy. I was not a lawyer, but I knew how to audit a liar. You do not ask them broad questions that allow them to spin a story. You ask them binary questions, yes or no, true or false. You box them in with geometry until they have nowhere to stand. I began to type. Question 1. Ms. Rourke, you are a commissioned notary public in the state of California, correct? Question 2. You understand that a notary journal is a public record that must be kept secure at all times? Question 3. On January 18th, at what specific time did you meet the signatory? Question 4. Where exactly did this meeting take place? I paused. If she lied and said she met me at my house, I had the badge logs. If she lied and said she met me at my office, I had the security video proving no visitors entered. Question 5. What form of government-issued identification did you physically handle and inspect? This was the trap. My driver's license had expired 3 months ago, and I had received the new one in the mail just last week. The issue date on my current license was after the date of the alleged signing. If she wrote down my current license number, she was lying because I didn't have it yet. If she wrote down the old one, I still had it in my possession, invalid and punched with a hole, locked in my safe. She couldn't have seen it. And if she wrote down a fake ID number provided by the imposter, then the numbers wouldn't match the DMV database. Question 6. Did you take a thumbprint? California law requires a thumbprint for any deed transferring real property. It is the one piece of evidence that cannot be forged. I typed the final question. Question 7. Can you please show the court the thumbprint in your journal for the entry on January 18th? I closed the laptop. The strategy was set. I wasn't going to argue with her. I was going to let her journal hang her. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the court system. Hearing reminder. Diaz versus Diaz. Evidentiary hearing on title dispute. Tomorrow. 900 hours. Department 4. I looked at the screen. The countdown had begun. I drove home, taking a different route than usual, winding through side streets to ensure I wasn't being tailed. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw Mrs. Gable standing on her porch, pretending to water a fern that was clearly plastic. She gave me a small wave. I waved back. She was the best security system money couldn't buy. I went inside and locked the door. I ate a dinner of cold toast because I couldn't stomach anything heavier. I spent the evening rehearsing the questions, saying them out loud to the empty room, refining the tone. I needed to sound like the voice of the system, cool, detached, inevitable. My parents were probably huddled with Warren Klein right now, trying to construct a narrative that fit the jagged edges of their lies. They were probably coaching Tanya Rourke. Just stick to the story. She was there. She signed it. She is crazy. But they didn't know about the badge logs. They didn't know about the rush fee receipt. They didn't know I had the timeline locked down to the minute. I went to bed at 10 o'clock. I placed the evidence binder on the nightstand next to me. Like a weapon. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into Department 4 not as a daughter, but as a prosecutor. I would look Tanya Rourke in the eye, and I would watch her decide between prison and the truth. And if the notary journal didn't stand up, then the whole house of cards, the investors, the courier, the parents, the shiny suit, would come crashing down. I closed my eyes. 9 o'clock, I whispered. Game over. The morning of the hearing, the air in the hallway outside Department 4 felt different. It was no longer the heavy, stagnant atmosphere of bureaucratic delay I had felt earlier in the week. Today, the air was electrically charged, vibrating with the static tension that precedes a storm. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in my darkest charcoal suit, my hair pulled back into a severe professional bun. I was not here to look appealing. I was here to look like the truth. I took my seat on the hard wooden bench, placing my evidence binder on my lap. My hands were cold, but my mind was operating at the humming frequency of a high-speed processor. I watched the elevator doors, waiting for the cast of characters to assemble for what my parents clearly hoped would be the final act of my undoing. They arrived 10 minutes later. Gwen and Hector Diaz stepped out of the elevator with a confidence that bordered on theatrical. My father was wearing a suit I had not seen in years. Freshly dry-cleaned, his posture erect, his chest puffed out like a man who believes he has already won the lottery. But it was my mother who drew my attention. Gone was the distraught, weeping mother from Tuesday. Gone was the aggressive, pleading manipulator from my front porch. Today, Gwen Diaz was playing the role of the long-suffering matriarch. She wore a soft, pastel pink cardigan over a floral blouse, a pearl necklace, and sensible shoes. It was a costume designed to evoke sympathy, to make her look harmless, frail, and fundamentally incapable of orchestrating a complex real estate fraud. She held onto my father's arm with both hands, looking up at him with adoring dependence. They did not see me at first, or perhaps they pretended not to. They walked to the far end of the hallway and huddled with Warren Klein. Their lawyer. Klein looked less enthusiastic than his clients. He was checking his watch, tapping his foot, his eyes darting around the hallway as if looking for an exit. He was a shark. Yes, but sharks know when there is blood in the water, and he was starting to suspect the blood might be his own. Then, the elevator pinged again. A woman stepped out. She was alone. She was dressed in a gray skirt suit that looked slightly too large for her, clutching a large, worn leather tote bag to her chest as if it contained a bomb. This had to be Tanya Rourke, the notary. I had expected someone slick. I had expected a professional con artist, someone with the hard eyes of a person who sells their integrity for cash. But Tanya Rourke looked like she was about to shatter. She was in her late 30s, with frizzy hair pulled back in a messy clip. Her face was pale, devoid of makeup, and there was a sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. She took a few steps into the hallway and stopped. She saw my parents. I watched her reaction closely. It was a study in human psychology. She did not wave. She did not smile. She flinched. Her eyes darted to my father, then to my mother, and then quickly to the floor. It was the look of a conspirator who has realized too late that she is the expendable asset. She walked to a bench on the opposite side of the hallway, sitting as far away from them as possible, curling her body inward around her bag. Inside that bag was the journal, the black box. I stood up and walked toward the courtroom doors, positioning myself so I could observe the dynamic. Tanya looked up and saw me. For a split second, our eyes met. I saw terror. She knew who I was. She looked at me, then looked at my parents, and then looked back at her hands, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather straps. She was not an arrogant criminal. She was a woman who had been pressured, paid, or threatened into doing something stupid, and now she was realizing that the people who hired her were going to let her take the fall. Warren Klein walked over to the bailiff standing by the door. I moved closer, ostensibly to check the docket list posted on the wall, but in reality to eavesdrop. "We need to discuss the calendar," Klein said to the bailiff, his voice low. "This matter is listed as an evidentiary hearing for an unlawful detainer, but the scope has expanded to a title dispute. Realistically, this should be transferred to the General Civil Division. We are going to move to continue the hearing so we can file the appropriate venue motions." I suppressed a smile. Klein was trying to run. He wanted to get out of Department 4. He wanted to delay. He knew that if this went to a General Civil Division, it would get buried in paperwork for months. Giving his clients time to sell the house or disappear, he wanted to turn off the spotlight. "Judge Sutter was pretty clear," the bailiff said, crossing his arms. "She wants to see the journal." Of course, Klein said, smoothing his tie. "But procedurally, a housing court judge ruling on a fraud claim, it is irregular." "I am not arguing procedure with you, counselor," the bailiff said. "You can tell it to the judge." Klein turned around and saw me standing there. His smile was tight, pasted on. "Ms. Diaz," he said, "good morning. I see you are still prepared." "I am," I said. "And Mr. Klein, just so you know, I will be objecting to any continuance. The issue is possession. My parents are trying to possess my home based on a forged document. The judge has jurisdiction to determine if the basis of the eviction is valid. We are not moving this case. Klein's eyes narrowed. You seem to know a lot about the law for a compliance officer. I know a lot about facts, I said, and the law usually follows them. I walked past him to the clerk's window, which had just opened. I had one final document to submit before the hearing began. I did not want to hand over my entire binder yet. I wanted to save the element of surprise for the cross-examination, but I wanted to frame the narrative before the judge even took the bench. Supplemental filing, I said to the clerk. A chronology of events. I handed her a single page. It was a timeline, stripped of all emotion, distilled down to pure, hard data. Timeline of events, January 18th, 2026, 7:42 a.m. Defendant badges into Crestline offices, Exhibit A, 1:38 p.m. Courier exchange observed at plaintiff's residence involving unknown male and plaintiff Hector Diaz, Exhibit B, 2:15 p.m. Quitclaim deed recorded at county recorder via walk-in service, Exhibit C, 2:15 p.m. Defendant captured on security video at desk, 10 miles away from recorder's office, Exhibit D, 6:18 p.m. Defendant badges out of Crestline offices, Exhibit A. It was a roadmap of impossibility. It showed two parallel timelines that could never intersect. The clerk stamped it, filed. I walked back to the bench. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the screen from my parents' prying eyes. It was a text from Mrs. Gable. She had evidently taken her role as my lead investigator very seriously. Scarlett, I was looking through the footage again from that Tuesday. I checked the street camera, not just the driveway. Before the black Mercedes arrived, another car was parked in front of your parents' house, a silver Toyota Corolla. It was there from 1 o'clock to 1:45. I stared at the screen. A silver Corolla. I got the plate. Mrs. Gable's next text read, captured it when it pulled away. License plate number 7HJK392. My heart hammered against my ribs. I quickly opened the web browser on my phone. I searched for license plate lookup. I didn't have access to the DMV database, but I had access to something almost as good. The QS Mobile Services website I had found yesterday. I went to the About Us page. There was a photo of the team standing in front of a branded van, but in the background of the photo, parked in the lot, was a silver Toyota Corolla. I zoomed in. The plate in the photo was partially obscured, but the first 3 characters were visible. 7HJ, it was Tanya Rourke's car. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a deafening click. Tanya hadn't met me. She hadn't met an imposter at a coffee shop. She had gone to my parents' house. She had driven to the house on Briar Glen. But not to my house. She had gone to the rental house my parents were staying in. Or perhaps they had met her at the curb. She had met my parents. They had likely presented a woman, maybe my mother in a wig, maybe a stranger, and Tanya had notarized the signature right there in the passenger seat of her Corolla. That was why she looked so terrified. She hadn't just been duped. She had been part of the meeting. She had been at the scene of the crime. I looked across the hall at Tanya. She was staring at the floor, rocking slightly. She knew exactly what she had done. She knew she had driven to the wrong address, or accepted a bribe to look the other way, or simply been too lazy to check the ID of the woman sitting next to my father. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to make a scene. I just needed to ask her where she was at 1:30 in the afternoon. I put my phone away. The bailiff opened the double doors to Department 4. All parties for Diaz versus Diaz. Please enter. My parents stood up. My mother smoothed her pink cardigan, took a deep breath, and composed her face into a mask of tragic reluctance. My father buttoned his jacket, looking ready to sell a used car. Warren Klein picked up his briefcase, his face set in a grim line, and Tanya Rourke stood up. She wobbled slightly on her heels. She gripped her bag so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked like a woman walking to the gallows. I stood up last. I picked up my folder. It felt light in my hands now. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was a key. I looked at the courtroom doors. Inside that room, There was a judge who believed in the sanctity of the seal. Inside that room, there was a witness stand that demanded the truth. I wasn't afraid. The fear had burned off days ago, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of the audit. I looked at my folder one last time, checking the tabs: fraud, forgery, alibi, timeline. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a demolition, and I was holding the detonator. I walked toward the doors. As I passed Tanya Rourke, I paused for just a fraction of a second. I didn't say anything. I just let her see the binder in my hand. I let her see the label on the spine. Evidence. She saw it. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly. I walked into the courtroom. The air was cool and smelled of furniture polish and justice. I walked to the defendant's table and set my binder down. I stood tall, waiting for the judge to take the bench. The storm was over. The flood was coming. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his voice bouncing off the wood-paneled walls of Department 4. Judge Marianne Sutter ascended the bench. She did not look at the docket list. She did not look at the computer screen. She looked directly at the witness stand, and then she looked at the heavy, leather-bound book resting on the railing in front of Tanya Rourke. "Be seated," Judge Sutter said. The rustle of fabric filled the room as we all sat down. But the silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a lung. "We are here for an evidentiary hearing regarding the validity of a deed used as the basis for an unlawful detainer action," Judge Sutter stated, her voice devoid of warmth. "Mr. Klein, you are representing the plaintiffs. Gwen and Hector Diaz. Ms. Diaz is representing herself, and we have a subpoenaed witness, Ms. Tanya Rourke." "Yes, Your Honor." Warren Klein stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Though I would like to renew my objection to the jurisdiction." "Overruled," Sutter said, cutting him off before he could finish the sentence. She turned her gaze to the notary. "Ms. Rourke, please take the stand. Bring your journal." Tanya Rourke stood up. Her legs were shaking so visibly that I could see the fabric of her skirt trembling. She walked to the witness box, clutching the journal to her chest like a shield. She was sworn in. "Ms. Rourke," Judge Sutter began, leaning forward, "you notarized a quitclaim deed on January 18th, transferring the property at 78 Briar Glen from Scarlett Diaz to Gwen and Hector Diaz. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Tanya whispered. "Speak up," Sutter commanded. "Yes, Your Honor," she repeated, her voice cracking. "And you witnessed the defendant, Scarlett Diaz, sign that document in your presence?" Tanya hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the plaintiff's table. My father was staring at her, his jaw set hard. My mother was picking at a loose thread on her cardigan, refusing to look up. "Yes," Tanya said. "She signed it in front of me." "Open your journal to the entry for January 18th, Judge Sutter ordered. Tanya fumbled with the book, her fingers slipping on the pages. She found the page and flattened it out. "Read the entry," Sutter said. "Specifically, I want to know what form of identification you used to verify the signer's identity." Tanya squinted at her own handwriting. "I used a California driver's license." "Read the number," Sutter said. "The full number you recorded." Tanya took a breath. D749-21104. I stood up immediately. I did not wait for permission. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the room, "I offer Exhibit H, my California driver's license." I walked to the bailiff and handed him my ID. He took it to the bench. Judge Sutter took the plastic card. She looked at it. She looked at her notes. She looked at Tanya. "Ms. Rourke," Judge Sutter said, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. "The license belonging to Ms. Diaz ends in 881. The license you recorded ends in 104. Can you explain that discrepancy?" The room went cold. Tanya blinked rapidly. I might have written it down wrong. It was a mistake, a transcription error." "That is 3 wrong digits, Ms. Rourke," Sutter said. "That is not a slip of the pen. Let us look at the time. What time does your journal say the signature took place?" Tanya looked back at the book. She looked trapped. 12:12 p.m., she said. 12:12? Judge Sutter repeated. She turned to me. Ms. Diaz? I picked up the badge logs from my table. Your Honor, Exhibit A, badge access logs from Crestline Compliance Solutions at 12:12 p.m. on January 18th. My biometric credentials were used to access the secure server room on the 4th floor of my office building. That building is 10 miles away from the location Ms. Rourke claims to have been. Judge Sutter looked at the logs I had submitted earlier. She nodded. So, the judge said, turning back to Tanya, at 12:12, the defendant was scanning her thumbprint into a secure server 10 miles away, yet you claim she was standing in front of you. Where exactly did this signing take place? Tanya swallowed hard. It was at a coffee shop, on Main Street, the Starbucks. I felt a surge of adrenaline. She was improvising, she was lying, and she was bad at it. Your Honor, I said. Exhibit C, the recorder's office intake receipt. The deed was recorded at 2:15 p.m., but the metadata I submitted shows it was a walk-in. If I was at a coffee shop on Main Street at 12:12 and then back at my desk at 2:15, as shown in the security video Exhibit D, the travel time simply does not work. Furthermore, I have a witness statement from Mrs. Agnes Gable, Exhibit B, stating she saw my father receive a folder from a courier at 1:38 p.m. in his driveway. Judge Sutter looked at Warren Klein. Counsel, your narrative is falling apart. We have a license that does not match. We have a time that is physically impossible, and we have a witness placing the deed in a courier's hand. Klein stood up, sweat beading on his forehead. Your Honor, memories fade. Perhaps the time in the journal was an estimate. Perhaps... Stop, Judge Sutter said. She slammed her hand down on the bench. The sound echoed like a gunshot. She turned her entire body toward Tanya Rourke. Ms. Rourke, Judge Sutter said, I want you to look at the defendant. Look at Ms. Diaz. Tanya slowly lifted her head. She looked at me. Describe the woman who signed that book, Sutter demanded. What was she wearing? What did her hair look like? Was she wearing glasses? Tanya opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted to my mother again. My mother was frozen, her face pale as a sheet. She had dark hair, Tanya stammered. Shoulder length, and she was wearing sunglasses, big sunglasses, and a scarf? I have waist-length hair. I have never worn a scarf in my life, and nobody signs a legal document in sunglasses unless they are hiding something. A look-alike, Judge Sutter said, leaning back in her chair. You notarized a signature for a woman in sunglasses and a scarf, with a fake ID, and you didn't ask her to take them off? She said she had an eye infection. Tanya blurted out. The lie hung in the air. Absurd and desperate. Ms. Rourke, Judge Sutter said, her voice quiet now. I am going to ask you one question, and before you answer, I want you to remember that perjury is a felony. I want you to look at the logs. I want you to look at the ID discrepancy, and I want you to look at the prison sentence attached to fraud. The judge leaned forward. Did Scarlett Diaz sign that book? Tanya looked at the judge. Then she looked at the plaintiff's table. She looked at my father, who was glaring at her with a mix of rage and panic. She looked at my mother, who had covered her face with her hands. They had promised her it would be easy. They had promised her $50 extra. They had promised her she was helping a family. They had lied to her, just like they lied to everyone else. Tanya Rourke crumbled. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a sob that sounded like something breaking. No, she whispered. I cannot hear you. Judge Sutter said. No, Tanya cried out, tears spilling down her face. She wasn't there. It wasn't her. It was a woman in the car. They drove up to the house. The mother was in the passenger seat, and there was a woman in the back. She had a wig on. They told me it was their daughter. They told me she was sick and couldn't come to the office. They gave me the ID. It looked real. I just wanted to get it done. Pandemonium broke out in the courtroom. Warren Klein sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. My father stood up as if to shout, but the bailiff took a step toward him, hand on his taser, and my father sank back down, defeated. "Let the record reflect," Judge Sutter said, her voice slicing through the noise, "that the witness has admitted to notarizing a forged signature." She turned to the clerk. "Vacate the default judgment immediately. Dissolve the writ of possession. The unlawful detainer case is dismissed with prejudice." She turned to Warren Klein. "Mr. Ma Klein, you are lucky I do not sanction you, but your clients are not so fortunate." She looked at my parents. The look she gave them was one of absolute disgust. "Gwen and Hector Diaz," she said. "I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into real estate fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The deed is hereby declared void ab initio. The title remains with Scarlett Diaz." Then she turned to Tanya. "And Ms. Rourke, I am referring your journal and this transcript to the Secretary of State. You will likely lose your commission, and you should get a lawyer for the criminal charges that are coming." Judge Sutter banged her gavel. Whack. "Court is adjourned." I stood there for a moment, the sound of the gavel ringing in my ears. It was over. The knot of anxiety that had been living in my chest for 3 days suddenly unraveled, leaving me feeling lightheaded. I gathered my binder. I closed the tabs. Fraud, forgery, alibi. I walked toward the exit. I had to pass my parents. They were sitting on the bench, frozen. My mother was weeping openly now, but it wasn't a performance anymore. It was the terrified crying of a woman who realizes the consequences have finally arrived. My father stared at the floor, his hands shaking. He looked up as I passed. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to blame me, maybe to ask for help. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't even look at him. I walked past them as if they were strangers, because they were. They were defendants in a criminal case, and I was the witness who had just buried them. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, blinding sunshine of the afternoon. I went straight to the recorder's office one last time. I filed the certified court order declaring the deed void. I watched Harold stamp it. I watched him update the system. The fraud alert was permanent now. No one would ever be able to touch that title again without my fingerprint. I drove home. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked different. It wasn't a disputed asset anymore. It wasn't a target. It was mine. I walked to the front door. I unlocked the high-security deadbolt. I stepped inside. The house was quiet. The sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I locked the door behind me. I threw the deadbolt. Click. I engaged the secondary lock. Click. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I looked at the eviction notice still sitting on the counter where I had left it on Tuesday morning. I picked it up. I walked to the trash can. I dropped it in. I was alone. My parents were facing felony charges. The investors would be looking for their money back, and they wouldn't find it. The war was over. I took a sip of water and looked out the window at the peaceful street. They had tried to use the system to break me. They didn't realize that I was the system. I closed my eyes and finally, for the first time in 30 years, I breathed in air that didn't cost me a thing. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear your thoughts on how Scarlett handled this legal chess match. So please comment down below and tell me where you are listening from. I always love to see how global our community is. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Monica Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this story get recommended to more people who need to see justice served.